When we give patients the rationale, when we explain to them what's going to happen with exposure and response prevention, and when we set it up collaboratively with them, I find, and people that I supervise, we find that people do engage, and it's not this terrible thing that a lot of TV shows and all that make it out to be. A lot of therapists that I come across are themselves afraid to do exposure therapy with their clients because maybe they're a little anxious about it. So it is definitely a thing where it's a challenge on both the patient side and the therapist side.
Welcome to Therapist Uncensored. Building on decades of professional experience, this podcast tackles neurobiology, modern attachment, and more in an honest way that's helpful in healing humans. Your session begins now with Dr. Ann Kelly and Sue Marriott.
Hey, you guys, while we know relationships are wonderful, they are also really hard. Many of us believe that they shouldn't be, that if we have good connection and good communication, things will just go smoothly. But it's really that belief that can make us feel stubborn and even more hopeless. So relationships take work. It does for Sue and I. We can make it look easy. It's not. And one of the ways is because many of us, we differ. We differ in what activates us, what makes us feel threat, the expectation, and it's these differences that are held in our body, not our thoughts. And they influence how we talk, how we love, how we fight. So holding that belief, if he or she or they could just understand me, if they love me, they do something different, is not really true. And we're talking about relationships with your partner, your teenager, your mother-in-law. So Sue and I have created an online course that can help you understand yourself and those you love in a different way. This is not just for therapists, it's for everyone. Although the good news is if you're a therapist, you can get CEs along the way, and all of you can use the visuals and the worksheets individually, or you can even use them in your own private practice. So while the course is based on our book, Secure Relating, Holding Your Own in an Insecure World, it is definitely not a replication of the book. We talk directly to you. You learn how to understand more deeply your attachment, those you love, the neuroscience behind it, and how to build secure types of connections right now in your everyday relationships. Rather than changing one another, y'all can shift together in very important ways. It's very powerful. We're getting great reviews. Check it out. It's at therapistuncensored.com/BAS. therapistuncensored.com/BAS. The BAS stands for Beyond Attachment Styles, the Science of Growing Secure Adult Relationships. And by the way, the cost of the course is about the amount of one individual therapy session, and yet you get hours and hours and hours of what we think is extremely valuable information. So check it out. Hey everyone, I'm excited about this 3-part series focusing on anxiety, obsessional thoughts, and the spectrum of OCD. Most of us are dealing with more stress and anxiety than we know what to do with. We check the news, it's a catastrophe. It can be so hard to turn our anxious brains off so that we can be more connected to ourselves and those we love. But here's the truth. We all have worry. We all have intrusive thoughts, whether they're about the state of the world, your kids' health, or maybe it's fear of rejection from your partner, your friends. The question isn't whether we have them, it's when we do, when do they cross the line from normal to something that becomes a problem in our lives or even becomes obsessive, compulsive, and even debilitating. So this series is about understanding that difference and what to do about it. In the first episode, I talked to Dr. Jon Abramowitz. He's one of the leading researchers and clinicians on OCD and anxiety disorders in the country. And in this episode, Jon and I discuss what intrusive thoughts are. He not only helps normalize them, but openly shares types of thoughts we have that we all have, but we're kind of scared to admit it because they're not who we are. But they're actually really common. So I think this discussion alone is worth the listen. But we cover so much more. Jonathan dives into when such normal worry and thoughts cross the line into OCD territory and takes over, even becoming bullies to us, our thoughts becoming bullies. We discuss the broad spectrum of how OCD can manifest and how to distinguish OCD from the more rigid personality patterns that center more on order, control, and perfectionism. They're not the same thing. Anyway, most of our discussion centers on treatment. Jon comes from a primarily cognitive behavioral perspective. He discusses exposure and response prevention, ERP, which is the gold standard evidence-based treatment, not only for OCD, but other types of anxiety. And then in our second episode, you'll hear from Allie Kristen. She is a marine biologist, and I love this, a penguin expert who has lived with OCD for nearly 20 years. So Allie shares in this episode her personal journey with OCD, from childhood symptoms to her diagnosis at age 12, her experience in therapy, and most importantly, how she's continued to independently manage and work with her OCD in her daily life. So she talks about the tools that helped her most, including just how she continues to reframe her relationship to the obsessional parts of herself. Anyway, I love talking with her. She talks about integration, not eradicating this part of her. And then our final episode, we hear from Melissa Mose. She's an OCD specialist and therapist who integrates internal family systems, IFS, with traditional ERP treatment. Melissa brings an attachment-focused relational lens to obsessional thoughts and behaviors and her OCD work. So looking at the protective parts, the wounded parts, and how to work with the whole person, not just the symptoms. So she addresses how OCD shows up in families, how partners unknowingly enable it, and how healing happens when we approach OCD with compassion rather than force. It's such a powerful conversation. I learned so much. I think you will too. So listen to the whole series, or just independent. They don't have to go together. Okay, in this first episode of our 3-part series, I'm speaking with Dr. Jon Abramowitz. Dr. Abramowitz is a professor of psychology and neuroscience at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he directs the Anxiety and Stress Disorder Clinic. So he is a world-leading expert in OCD and anxiety disorders. He has over 300 peer-reviewed publications, over 10 books. His most recent book, I was really interested. It's Living Well with OCD, Practical Strategies for Improving Your Daily Life. So this is not a treatment-related book. He's got such a gift. You'll notice this in the conversation of explaining what's happening when you're stuck in an obsessive loop and how to break the cycle. His book is for everybody's everyday use when we get stuck. All right, let's jump in. Hi, Jon. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Anne. It's a pleasure to be here.
I am so excited to have you. I say that I've decided to do a series on OCD and anxiety. And in all my research about like who's been out there, and actually both in the research and in clinical practice, and has been writing about it and has expertise in this broad context, it was you, that you were like the living example. Like, okay, my PhD program, they touted the scientist practitioner model. And I really believe that. And for those of you out there that's like, I'm going to be a clinician, but I'm also going to ongoingly do research and add to the field so that my work is quite active. And that's you, am I right?
We had the same thing in our graduate program as well. I love being a clinical psychologist. Like every day I wake up, seriously, and I'm just like so thrilled to be in this profession because you can do so many different things. And I love the research end, and I love doing clinical work, and I love the teaching, as an academic, the teaching and being able to do these kinds of things and just educate folks. And so I appreciate that. That is what I strive for, to be a scientist, practitioner, clinical scientist. There are different ways that we say it.
Well, let's jump in to talk about your expertise is in anxiety as well, in the whole spectrum to OCD. And how would you describe, not your credentials, but how would you describe your work, what it's all about?
Yeah, I mean, I am I think in terms of cognitive behavioral models of psychology. So our thinking has like most of to do with how we feel when we become anxious. It's because we have certain catastrophic thoughts. We're perceiving threats. And often that's good. We need anxiety. It's helped us in our evolutionary past. Humans wouldn't be here if we didn't have that. But when we develop an anxiety disorder or an anxiety-related disorder, it's because those catastrophic perceptions of threat are coming up when we don't need them, when they're exaggerated or kind of out of proportion to what's actually happening. And I'm fascinated by that. I wouldn't describe myself as a particularly anxious person, but I get anxious sometimes. So I certainly get, that experience. And there's a lot of science behind a cognitive behavioral approach to understanding and treating anxiety. And when I was in grad school, I got, the opportunity to work with folks who had these kinds of presentations, OCD, panic attacks, social anxiety, learned how to implement these kinds of, techniques based on these cognitive behavioral models. People got better, like, oh my goodness. And it just was very reinforcing to me. I want to do that. I feel like I have a knack for it. I want to contribute to the literature. I want to teach people how to do it. And so, I was off and running.
So it sounds like when you come from a cognitive behavioral approach, you think of thoughts come and then the body responds. And some people, especially somatic workers, they would say, our body activates and then we make up or we then attribute thoughts to that. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I would not completely disagree. The body certainly does things. Our bodies are noisy. They produce sensations. They produce all sorts of, feelings and all of that. And we interpret those, right? So I could see where it can go both ways. People who have panic attacks, for example, they experience a rush of adrenaline. Maybe they're excited about something, or maybe they just associate being stuck in traffic with having a panic attack and their heart starts to pound. And then they interpret that as, oh no, now I'm really dying. I think there's more data to suggest that our thinking influences our emotions, and our body, of course, mind and body are tied very, very tightly. So I, ascribe to the view that the thinking comes first, even though we don't always we're not able to say, I'm telling myself this. Those thoughts are often, and they call them automatic thoughts, and they can be very habitual. But that's kind of how I would see it.
So one of the things I want to do is kind of start with general anxiety, some of your expertise in normal fears, normal thoughts and anxiety, and then how it progresses in your mind to how we could tell whether that's anxiety, and then when it becomes too rigid and possibly into the realm of OCD. And especially now, you were talking about catastrophic thoughts. Okay, well, people are having a lot of catastrophic thoughts right now. They come in, they're stuck in worry about this uncertainty of this world. They have checking behaviors, some of the things you describe, seeking reassurance through the media, whether that's reassurance that the world's going to fall apart or that it's not. And we just don't know how to be right now. And how do we know whether this is just normal ways of relating in this really, intense, uncertain world, or when it's tipped over into a level of anxiety that we need to be looking at?
I would say that when it starts to interfere with your functioning, that's when it's becoming a problem. So sure, we all have thoughts about, the world and what's going on and, politics and all sorts of social media, all sorts of, hot button things that people have strong feelings about. And for the most part, people have they have their thoughts, they have their ideas about it. They might feel anxious or angry or whatever, and they kind of move on. They don't get bullied around by their thoughts, by their feelings. But then when it starts to get to the point where, physiologically, maybe you're losing sleep, right? Or you become so anxious or angry that you're engaging in destructive behavior, breaking things, yelling at people, carrying on social media to the point that, no one wants to talk to you. Or when you're so anxious that you're, avoiding things to the point, again, that it gets in the way. Like, sure, don't go on social media, don't turn on the news. That's probably not going to hurt you too much. But if it's like, I can't talk to anybody, or, I'm so worried that I can't sleep, or I'm losing weight, things like that I'm not trying to lose, that I would say is probably getting into the clinical realm where it would be helpful to get some help. And also similarly, if it's causing a great deal of distress, we all experience distress. My parents would remind me, by the way, that like we don't have a monopoly on viewing the world as dangerous. When my parents were younger, they would hide under their desk because of the possibility of being bombed. I don't know what hiding under a desk would really do, but
We laugh about that now.
right. But there have always been these kinds of existential threats. I grew up in the 1980s, and we were convinced that the Russians were going to send nuclear bombs, to America. So there's, each generation has their thing. I think with the advent of the internet and just we're in the information age, it's a lot easier now to get tuned in and go down a rabbit hole of things that make things seem like they're awful or worse than previous generations. But that's something that we've always wrestled with. There was the Great Depression in the 1930s. I mean, we don't have to go into that. But when it's particularly causing a lot of distress and when it's getting in the way of functioning, leading to physiological problems, that's when I would say it's probably a problem worth getting some help with.
Well, let's say that it's not quite over that realm, but I think it's quite normal sometimes to have obsessional thoughts, right? Like, in other words, a thought that repeats over and over again. You can't get it out of your head, this world falling apart. It's not an unusual thing if I have, a thought that becomes pretty reoccurring for that to be a big problem, right? How do we distinguish like an obsessional thought from being something that feels natural and some that happens to all of us, I believe? And I guess you're saying if it clicks over, but what is, especially right now, we can't get away from media, right? Like, I guess we can minimize it, but we can't get away from things that are alarming our system, which is a little different than the 1980s. We had the news that we watched, et cetera. Now it's bombarding our nervous system. So if it's bombarding our nervous system, what would you just recommend to the average individual out there how to handle that?
Yeah, like stop letting yourself be bombarded. Turn it off. Get your news from one source once a day. If there is going to be some sort of catastrophe, you'll probably hear about it in our world anyway. But do you need to know every little thing that every politician says and does and all of that? Probably not. We were probably, again, when I was growing up, we had our news. There was the local news at 6 o'clock, and then there was the national news at 6:30. They were half-hour shows, and that was where we got our information from. Or you read the paper, but, we don't really have that anymore. As far as I'm concerned, that's what I try to limit myself to. I just don't have the time to get so engaged. But that's what I would recommend.
Okay. And then how would we know? So you mentioned that if it starts taking over and you're having these thoughts and you've tried to limit, and I brought in the politics, but we can have obsessional thoughts about all sorts of different things, the health of our children, the welfare of our parents. We can have thoughts that all of a sudden become preoccupying. And often that's related to things that we don't really have control over. Is that right?
Yeah, so we all think about negative stuff sometimes. Probably important that the brain produces those kinds of thoughts, probably helps us to protect against danger, and sometimes we think about things that really could happen, realistic, what if I don't get that job? What if my, loved one becomes ill, stuff like that. And then often we have just senseless intrusive thoughts. What if I acted completely out of character? What if I said something terrible to someone? What if I did something terrible? What if I was responsible for something? And I think, for the most part, we're able to see those thoughts. Most people see those thoughts for what they are, mental noise, right? And but then sometimes people they appraise those thoughts as important. If I'm thinking about this, maybe it means something about me. If I'm thinking about harming my loved one that I would never do anything to hurt, but I'm having this thought, maybe that means there's something wrong, and I better try to control that thought. And then we get into trouble because it's hard to control our thoughts. The more we try to control them, they only become more intense. And now, oh no, I'm trying to get rid of this thought and it's only coming back more. Why is that happening? I must really be, some terrible person. And then that's when a person can get into OCD, where they get into this struggle against their own thoughts that you can't win. You won't win that struggle.
Yeah, I remember and I know other people report this, that, when you first have a child and they're holding this little bitty baby, you can have really destructive thoughts about this baby that you love and adore. I could drop this baby down the stairs right this second. What's preventing me from doing that? And people report having that. And then there's this, oh my God, what's wrong with me? And that's what I think I hear you saying, is that having a thought of something come through my body doesn't mean that I'm actually going to act on it or I'm a horrible person. In fact, it's quite normal.
Quite normal. I got interested in studying perinatal and postpartum OCD because when my oldest was born, my wife and I would take turns getting up in the middle of the night to feed her. And after you give a baby a bottle, what do? You burp the baby, patting her on the back. I have 2 daughters. So there I would be at 2 o'clock in the morning. My wife is sound asleep. It's me and this tiny little, 2-week-old. She slurps down the bottle and then I'm patting her. And at one point the thought went through my mind, what if I just reared back and beat the heck out of her? I love my kid. I would never do that. Me being an OCD nerd, like I understood exactly what was happening. These are just intrusive thoughts. But up until then, people thought that postpartum OCD only affected new moms because they have the hormones and all that stuff that are changing. And wait a minute, I don't have the hormonal changes. I didn't actually have the baby. Maybe dads can have this too. And so we did lots of research and found, lo and behold, yes, of course, people partners have these kinds of thoughts also, and they're normal. And everyone has senseless, intrusive thoughts. It's what we do with those thoughts. It's how we appraise them and interact with them and relate with them. That's what makes all the difference.
Well, say more about that. So how would you recommend relating to them? And then tell us about how you see people getting stuck in them, and so that to the point where they start moving over to the spectrum of more OCD type of relationship to them.
Well, we want to see them for what they are. Mental noise, I think I read somewhere once we have like 6,000 different thoughts a day. That's a lot of thoughts. Some of them are going to be really useful. Some of them are going to be totally senseless. Some of them are going to be really positive, like what if I scored the winning goal in the Stanley Cup finals, right? Or really bad, like what if I beat the crap out of my 2-week-old baby, right? That's just what our mind does. And there's no explanation for why, and we don't need an explanation for why. That's just part of being alive. That's just like blinking or breathing. It's just part of, the way our brains work. So what we want folks to do, what's the healthy way to relate to them, is to see them as, brain farts, mental noise, just to kind of look, oh boy, I'm thinking about that now. That's a doozy, right? When people develop obsessional problems like OCD, they see those thoughts as facts. They take them at face value. They interpret them literally. And then that starts this whole cascade of anxiety, right? Because as I said before, anxiety is a result of the perception of threat. So if I'm sitting there, I'll just use my example. If I'm sitting there burping my baby and I have this thought, what if I, hauled off at her? Then all of a sudden I'm perceiving some sort of threat. Maybe I'm dangerous. Maybe I'm not, who I think I am. There's the concept called the feared self, right? Maybe I am not who I think I am, and I'm more dangerous than I thought that I was. And then I'm going to try to control the thought because I don't want to be that feared self. I'm going to try to suppress the thought. I'm going to try to maybe avoid, honey, why don't you feed the baby at night because I just don't feel that comfortable. And so I avoid. Or I might do rituals. I might pray, God, don't let me harm the baby. There's no risk to begin with because I'm not going to hurt the baby, most likely, very, very most likely. But as soon as I start to avoid, as soon as I start to do rituals, as soon as I start to thought suppress, I've turned that thought into something. Now it's becoming a bully, right? And it's going to start to kind of push its way into my life and then push me around. Well, I can't do this and I can't do that because of the thoughts. Maybe I shouldn't change the baby because what if I have an inappropriate thought there? And it starts to kind of take over. And that's the way that, we have lots of research now, longitudinal research, particularly with new parents, showing that that is a process that plays out. Yeah, so that's kind of how these things can get started. I'm very much oversimplifying it, but that's the basic idea.
So what I'm hearing is that like the more we actually see the thought as being us and a reflection of our real desires or likely behavior, the more we believe. And I love the way you put it, becoming a bully, right? Like that, when my thoughts become a bully to me, what do bullies do? They start to control us. They start to manhandling us. And then we're scared of the bully. And so we try to avoid them and go a different way home from school. Like all of a sudden now I'm not taking care of the baby. Yeah.
That's right. And to carry on with the analogy, bullies are not really threats. Bullies have low self-esteem. That's why they bully. And so if you stand up to the bully, which is what we do in cognitive behavior therapy, exposure and response prevention, and acceptance and commitment therapy, we help people to stand up to the bully and lean into it and approach rather than avoid, and expose the bully for what that thought really is, that it's just a senseless idea and you can think about it all day long while you're doing your valued activities.
We're going to dive deep as we go along about what exposure and response prevention is. But what's interesting about this is that we're just talking thoughts here, right? Thoughts that can turn obsessional and into OCD, but they're literally thoughts. And well, although you moved it into behavior, you said if I started praying and I started like, I have to pray before I go to change the baby every single time. So tell me about how that would turn into an OCD kind of behavior. But we also have just OCD that just involves thoughts. It's not always the hand washing and the things that movies tell us about OCD is that I'm all into germs and I'm hand washing. And if I'm not doing that, I'm not OCD. But you're really describing OCD in a few different ways. Can you play that out for us?
Well, OCD is a very heterogeneous problem. And so, there's that saying, if you've met one, you've met them all. With OCD, if you've met one person with OCD, you've met one person with OCD. Everyone is a little bit different, which makes it, for me, it's fascinating to understand each person's internal logic and how the obsessions are connected to the compulsions. So getting back to the example of the praying, I might feel like I need to pray to God so that I don't do anything terrible and act on these thoughts. So maybe, I would say a prayer before I burp the baby. And then when I don't actually haul off at the baby, what gets the credit? The prayer. And so I never have a chance to learn, actually, I wasn't going to act anyway on those thoughts because that's completely not who I am. And my thoughts don't dictate my behavior. I do. But if I'm always praying, the ritual will get the credit. And then I go on believing that I'm like this far from doing something awful. And these thoughts really are important. And I need to pray. And then it's like, well, I didn't pray the right way. Maybe I should pray. Maybe I should repeat the prayer. Maybe I need to do it perfectly. Or maybe I need to do it 3 times. Oh, but wait a minute. 3 times 3 isn't, is an unlucky number. Maybe I need to do it 4 times. And it just kind of snowballs and snowballs. And over time, the person just develops, these rituals. And that's just one example, but this can happen with compulsive washing. If a person's afraid of getting, sick from germs from the door, right? It can happen with checking if they're afraid of, maybe I left the door unlocked and once I'm in bed, I can't prove that the door is locked. I need to check to get that reassurance because OCD is all about the need for reassurance. So there are different ways that this can kind of show up.
So why doesn't then, if I am laying in bed and I think, oh my God, did I lock the door? I didn't lock the door. I'm going to go check. So I go and I check. Whew, the door's locked. Now I have this release of anxiety and I go back to bed. Why isn't that enough?
For most people, it would be, and we all check sometimes, right? When people have OCD, one of the big kind of like cognitive distortions that we call it, or I guess thinking patterns, core beliefs, is this need for like 101% guarantee. That's just not possible. So yeah, I'm laying in bed. Most likely, if I checked even 4 or 5 times, most likely the door is still locked. I would go so far as to say it probably is locked. But what OCD does is it says to a person, you don't have 101% guarantee. It's not enough to just take it on faith that you checked it, because it is possible that maybe I got it wrong when I went and checked. I thought it was locked, but maybe, because we all make mistakes sometimes. People with OCD are really smart, and they think about all these possibilities, instead of thinking about the probabilities. And so with a lot of practice, checking and practicing with, and I say practice in an unfortunate way, practicing managing uncertainty by trying to check, that just reinforces this idea that I can't live with uncertainty. I need to check. And we're not talking about 50-50 uncertainty. I think most people would check if it was 50-50. But even for folks with OCD, even things that we all take for granted and might think, oh yeah, you definitely locked the door. OCD has a way of saying, yeah, but what about this? And the more we try to fight that, the yeah, buts get louder and louder. And that's where a person with OCD gets stuck. The only way out seems like I got to check or get someone else to check for me.
So there's a whole cycle, is what you're saying. And then it sounds like the cycle intensifies. So you have the fear, the anxiety, the possibility, you're saying, that is, oh my gosh, I could have missed something. And if I do the ritual, or I'd start to get almost, that's where the C comes in. It's like compulsively, if I let that possibility exist and I don't engage in this behavior, it could be really, really horrible. And then it's a temporary release, but then I keep repeating it. So that's a little bit of the OCD cycle that we get into. And then I think what you're saying is it's sort of self-fulfilling because we do get a release. Instead of being there paralyzed in bed, we're like, okay, I've gotten up, whew, and then I go back. But that sounds so painful. If I can't, is what makes it come back? You're saying that, all right, it's the possibility rather than the probability. So why does somebody get more likely to get stuck in the possibilities rather than the probabilities?
Some really cool research out of Canada, a researcher by the name of Adam Radomski, has found that actually the more that we check, the more uncertain we become. And it's, there are different hypothesized reasons for that. But one reason is it's just you're now making this whole need for certainty, it just becomes a thing. And so the doubt that you experience once you get back in bed after checking the door, okay, I just checked the door to make sure, okay, now I got relief. But sooner or later, because this is a nightly thing, something's going to trigger that doubt again. And instead of being able to say, wait a minute, I checked it, it's probably fine, which is, I think, what most of us would say. If you have OCD, you can't just live with it's probably fine. I got to know 100%. I got to get rid of any shadow of a doubt. And that just will keep coming back. The more you try to fight it and get certainty, that just kind of attracts more doubts. And that's just the way these compulsive behaviors work. And you said it absolutely right. Because you get some temporary relief from that discomfort, from that doubt, that's reinforcing, right? You're escaping distress, and we call that negative reinforcement. And so you're going to go back. These behaviors, reinforcement means that you increase the probability of a behavior. And so here we're increasing a probability of behavior by removing a negative stimulus, like the doubt and uncertainty and anxiety. And so when you learn really quickly, boy, I did that behavior, it made me feel better, even if temporarily, I'm going to go back and do it again because that's what seems to work. And they just feel like they need more and more and more of that.
It sounds so painful to get caught in that loop.
Oh my God. Well, people lose sleep, people lose partners. OCD can be a devastating problem. Absolutely.
And would you say in general, do people with OCD generally have this one element that they're caught in? Well, you said as many people with OCD as many different manifestations. So I really hear that. So one person may literally just be focused on door locking or hand washing. But in your experience in working with this, is it more typical for people to have, if they have a response in one area, do they usually have it in multiple areas, or is it usually more of a single lane focus typically?
It really varies. There's some people that are kind of like, just one area that they focus on like the entire course of the disorder. And then there are other people that are in different, but there tend to be some themes, and often they revolve around things that are valuable to the person, that are important to the person. It's no surprise that new parents, when they have like perinatal OCD, it's usually about harm coming to the kid, because that's the most important thing, right, in their lives. when you have someone who has religious scrupulosity, which is a presentation of OCD that involves religious obsessions, like what if I go to hell when I die? What if I don't have a good relationship with God? Those people are not going to be, atheists. They're going to be religious. OCD tends to attack the things that we care about the most. That's where we're the most vulnerable. That's where our doubts and uncertainties are the most sensitive to us, and where we're more sensitive to getting bullied around.
So treatment, if we stick with both, I'm curious about the religiosity. What did you call it again?
Scrupulosity.
I'm very interested in that, somebody working with that, because I can just think of, man, we have it on our own accord, right? And then we have things that promote it, right? Whether it's door locking or religion, all we have to do is gather information from the world to say neighbors are getting broken into, or you're going to go to hell if you don't believe in this leader, or if you don't support this. I think there's a lot to promote that kind of insecurity perpetually that would sort of feed this loop, I imagine.
I think there's that, and also like a lot of people who have scrupulosity, they have a view of God that is inconsistent with their religion. They view God as vengeful, as like looking out for you to make a mistake so he can throw the lightning bolt at you and things like that. And I think that most, not all, but most religions don't ascribe to such a rigid and, angry view of God. But then the other part of that is that if you read the Bible, some of the attributes of God, he can read your mind. You better not think about bad stuff, right? He doesn't have a lot of tolerance for doing bad things, because you read about all sorts of stuff, primarily in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament, about, like all these innocent people in Sodom and Gomorrah get struck down, and Abraham tries to, bargain with God. If I can find 10 people. Now, I want to say that the vast, vast, vast majority of religious people do not develop OCD. So religion does not cause OCD. But if you are religious and you have OCD, there's, a good chance that it's going to revolve around your religion. Again, religion is about faith. What is faith? Faith means I have this belief even though I don't have 101% ironclad proof.
So if you were going to apply your best expertise and pick either one of those in terms of helping somebody with OCD, I mean, it sounds like, it's a very distressing thing. You're saying it's interrupting in your life, it's interrupting in your relationship. So you have a sign, you typically have a sign this is not working for you and not going well. What would the intervention be? And tell us a little bit about exposure and response prevention. And I know that sometimes you add ACT. Share with us your intervention suggestions.
Sure, yeah. So very clearly, the most well-researched psychological intervention is exposure and response prevention, ERP for short. And what it does is it helps people learn new information. And ERP isn't just used for OCD. It's actually used for any sort of fear-based problem, social anxiety, panic attacks, post-traumatic stress disorder, phobias, things like that. With exposure therapy, what it means literally is we're going to help you to gradually approach some sort of stimulus. It could be a situation, it could be a thought, it could be a body sensation, physical sensation. We're going to help you to approach that in a therapeutic way where you can learn that it's not as dangerous as you thought that it was, where you can test out your prediction that, if I sit there and burp my baby and think about hitting her very hard, that I'm not going to lose control and actually do that, contrary to what the OCD is telling me. So that's all exposure is. It's helping people, coaching them through, challenging them to do these things that they've been avoiding because they have these fear predictions. Response prevention means coaching clients, patients, helping them to resist those rituals, those strategies that they have of trying to make themselves feel better in the moment, because we know that those don't work. And instead, what we want them to see with exposure and response prevention is that the situation they are afraid of is not as dangerous, not as likely as they thought, that they can get through the distress that they experience and the uncertainty and the intrusive thoughts that they experience when they're doing the exposure, And this is a very empowering therapy because not only does it help the person to say, oh, you know what, I can manage that uncertainty. Oh, the doorknob isn't so dangerous. Oh, I'm not a terrible person that's going to lose control if I have one bad thought or even 17 bad thoughts. It helps them to learn also that I am strong. I can do distress. I can do intrusive thoughts. I can do uncertainty. And that's where ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, comes in because it helps people to see those private experiences in a different light. Instead of something like a bully, it helps you to see them as, you know what, I don't like this, but I don't have to rearrange my life around that. And so ACT and ERP go hand in hand very well. And I'll just say, like, the science is very strong behind exposure and response prevention, a meta-analysis, in other words, a analysis of all the well-controlled studies that have been done just came out, several weeks ago, just reaffirming what we already know. These papers come out every several years or so, that ERP has a strong database of well-controlled studies. It's not a panacea. Not everyone gets better. But overall, this is your treatment of choice, your first-line treatment.
So what is the hardest part? I mean, what you're saying is it sounds like if I am really scared that I'm going to hurt my child, and I'm like, okay, but you're shifting it from a possibility to a probability. What's the probability you're going to do that is small. And I would have to tolerate the uncertainty and the fears. So I imagine that if it's bringing me enough distress that I'm into ritualized behaviors, that's a lot of distress. So what helps me, like I imagine doing this therapy is really challenging because I'm going to have to manage so much distress with the possibility that I could be wrong. How do you help somebody with that?
Learning through experience is, what better teacher is there than your own experience? We can't talk someone out of OCD. We've tried that for decades before we had exposure and response prevention, and it doesn't work. You can't convince someone with OCD by kind of trying to talk them out of it. They have to see for themselves. Now, so going back to me burping the baby, is it 100%, let me say, is it 0% likely that I'm going to hurt my baby? Absolutely not. It's not 0%. It's really freaking low. And you know what, though? We all, name me something that is a 0% likelihood of danger. I can't think of anything, even, crossing the street, or even, there are people that will die on their staircase. They will fall down and break their neck or something and have a head injury on their staircase today in the US somewhere. So even something as routine as going up and down your stairs is not a 0%, I say to my wife, I'll be home at 6:30 for dinner. What I really mean is my plan is to be home at 6:30 unless I die in a car accident coming home. No, we don't say that because the risk
It's
is
reassuring.
the risk is sufficiently low.
Right.
But there is no such thing as absolute certainty. And so we all have to, and most of us do, and I even tell people with OCD, in 95% of your life, you manage uncertainty perfectly well. How'd you get to this session? I drove. Oh, you drove? Oh my goodness, And of course, the risk of having a car accident is a lot higher than, hitting your baby when you don't want to. So we want people to understand that the risk can never be zero, but it doesn't have to be. We all manage in our lives with some even really, really small level of risk. And that's what I want folks to understand. That's what we're all about, is learning how to manage even those, really small degrees of uncertainty. OCD is saying it's a big risk. It's 50-50 chance, right? And so it's about doing exposure and learning, no, it's not really like that. I have the experience under my belt to prove to me. Yes, it is challenging. And yes, people experience distress. And that, I'll say two things about that. One is it's not usually as awful as people think. I find myself saying this to people all the time. The anticipation is worse than the actual doing it, because really quickly people realize, often think this is senseless. Not everybody, but most folks.
What I'm wondering too, though, is a couple different things. One, you're talking about us having to tolerate the lack of control. Do individuals with OCD, and we have the spectrum of OCD, I want to start kind of diving deeper into that, but this idea of I don't have control over something and I have to tolerate that in and of itself is a really painful idea, especially if I don't have control over, if I don't say a prayer, my child's not going to make it safe on this trip. And so why would I want to tolerate the risk of that? You're telling me, nah, why don't you just not do that? And we'll see. But if I have a 5%, 2% chance that my child could hurt, and I have a perceived sense of control that if I say this prayer, then that's going to help. How are you going to convince me to just see?
Yeah, great question. And I think it comes down to like, what are the pros and cons of doing that? How much is the OCD getting in your way, and doing the rituals? Okay, fine. And I think we all have little rituals or little checks or things like that. I know I happen to not have OCD, but every time I leave my house and I put the little button to put down the garage, I know there is a spot between two houses in my neighborhood where I can see back to my house and make sure that my garage, and I check every darn time I drive past that. Now, if I got stuck going back to check and couldn't leave my neighborhood for like 2 hours because I kept going back to check, then I would probably decide, well, this is getting in the way too much. So I think we all have those, and OCD is on a continuum. And when it gets to the point that it's causing impairment in functioning, causing a lot of distress, then we would say, yeah, you probably would do well to get some help for that. When we give patients the rationale, when we explain to them what's going to happen with exposure and response prevention, and when we set it up collaboratively with them, I find, and people that I supervise, we find that people do engage, and it's not this terrible thing that a lot of TV shows and all that make it out to be. A lot of therapists that I come across are themselves afraid to do exposure therapy with their clients because maybe they're a little anxious about it. So it is definitely a thing where it's a challenge on both the patient side and the therapist side. But yeah, with a good rationale, and again, I think that gets to what we're talking about here too.
Well, and what I'm hearing is that it's very important that you've been pointing out that this is not just pointing out the irrational parts of it, because that is not going to work to convince your partner not to be worried, the baby's fine. It's just, if it's moved into an OCD, more of a compulsive realm, then the body's in sort of its own cycle and you can't just rationalize it out. And so what you're saying is that whether you do it with a therapist or whether you do it through other methods, that helping yourself recognize compassionately that you have to get through this loop and experience the activation in your body and the discomfort and then moving through it rather than satisfying it, that is usually important in this.
I agree 100%. Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
So what I'm hearing in this level of OCD is that you feel distressed about it. It's something that's interrupting. There is also an element of OCD that can be part of somebody's personality. And I'm wondering if you can help us describe the difference. In other words, somebody who might really not see that their need for control and rituals, et cetera, is an issue. It's just part of their disposition and personality that makes sense, and everybody should be following their lead. Is that right?
Yeah. So there is this diagnosis called Obsessive-Compulsive Personality Disorder, OCPD. And it's kind of what you're describing. So these are folks that their traits are to be kind of more rigid, like things have to be done a certain way. It's got to be, it's like my way or the highway. And again, a lot of people have some of that. That's something that's on a continuum. When it gets in the way of relationships, when it gets in the way of productivity, because you're so focused on things having to be done a perfect way. And if it's not even worth trying at all. So a lot of kind of all or nothing dichotomous thinking. So gets in the way. That's when it becomes a problem. And what's unfortunate is that the two problems have the same name, OCD and OCPD. As you said, in OCPD, you don't see a lot of people with OCD saying, hey, I have a problem. I need help for this. It's usually other people that are like, I'm having trouble, living with this person because they're so rigid about how everything has to be, but they don't see it as a problem. They don't want help. In OCD, there's still some people who don't see it as a problem, but generally speaking, the OCD itself is distressing, gets in the way of their own life, and they don't like that.
So the part about OC, I can see having the mixed names is a little bit confusing because they actually have very different manifestations.
Very different. Yeah, we have good old Sigmund Freud to blame for that.
Okay. Well, the OCPD, just to understand that a little bit more, is very different. Doesn't mean that somebody has OCD. I guess you could have an overlap, right? You could have OCPD with OCD.
Yeah. Not as common as you think, though. Not as common as you. Just because they have the two names doesn't mean that they're necessarily. You do see it. And sometimes it can be difficult to tease apart what's what, as with a lot of the mental health, disorders, the psychiatric disorders. It's not straightforward. Like, is it this or is it that? It's not like, you take a COVID test and either you have COVID or you have some other virus. With mental health, it's not that cut and dry. Again, we could talk about that another time.
Well, with OCPD, I think the thing that may be really difficult, and see if you would agree with me, is just what you said earlier, is that the way of them seeing the world and impose, it still has a lot to do with this desire or this need to feel like we have control environment and not living in uncertainty. And if I can control the environment around me and how things look and how things manifest, then I'm more efficient at work. I mean, oftentimes when I see it manifesting, it's hard to convince somebody that it's not functional because they're very productive at work and very organized. It's just everybody else seems to not get it. And so how do you go about, let's say you were talking to the partner out there that is living with somebody, and I would imagine that if you don't fall in line, you're going to have conflict, right? Like what would the suggestion relationally be for somebody with OCPD? And then I want to go back to OCD if we could.
Sure. Yeah, well, there are communication skills that people can learn how to, express in an assertive and a way that lands well with your partner. Hey, I don't like when this happens. Here's how I feel about this. And then there are ways to, compromise and try to find a middle ground. That can be difficult for a person if they have those, rigid personality traits. What we do therapeutically one-on-one is helping people with what we call flexibility training. And that involves thinking differently, not in this kind of all or none dichotomous way, but to be able to see things like in a spectrum and shades of gray rather than just kind of black or white. And then also behavioral, kind of like exposure. It's a little different because you're not teaching people to not be afraid, but you're helping them to learn, I can, behave in a more flexible way and I can manage that distress that comes up and get through that, even if it's unpleasant. And actually that unpleasantness goes away over time once you practice with this.
So that's when you're helping the individual with it, but they would have to probably really see the distress. So in some ways, having that partner come to you and say, this is not working for me. It seems like the distress likely for somebody with OCPD is going to come from their outside environment. And what you're seeing is like the idea of working with somebody like that is to teach them flexibility rather than to double down on control. If everybody would just follow my lead, then. So you're saying is helping somebody learn to be with flexibility. And I guess also to recognize there is anxiety, because if the house isn't in perfect order, and if you're going to be experiencing some level of anxiety, and I imagine it's also teaching somebody that if they don't have control, that to experience the anxiety that comes up and to learn to tolerate that internally rather than trying to manifest control of the external environment. Is that accurate?
I would agree with that. And also just to kind of give up, put down the rope in that tug of war, because forget about ever having everything exactly the way that you want it. It's just the world doesn't give you that. And so how are you going to respond to that? Are you going to keep trying and that's futile? Or can you, maybe make some changes in how you see the world?
That's very helpful. Okay. So I know we're going to run out of time. I have a couple of more questions if you have time.
Sure. Let's do it.
Okay. So there's also this element, and what do you think about relational OCD, ROCD? Is that part of a continuum? Do you see it as separate? Do you think it's a real thing?
Yeah, there's research on this. There's a fella by the name of Guy Doron. He's in Israel, and he's done some really interesting stuff, kind of looking at it from an OCD perspective. And I think there's something to that. I think one of the problems with
before you jump to the problem, can you describe what it is?
Oh, sure, yeah. Well, and actually that's one of the problems, because I think it's not clear exactly, because it can show up in different ways. What people are calling relationship OCD can be jealousy. Like, I have to check on my partner that they're not texting with someone outside of our relationship and cheating on me. It can show up as maybe this is the wrong relationship for me. Maybe I'm not in the right relationship and this isn't my person. I was just working with someone just last week who was like, I have this intrusive thought that what if there's someone better? This person's been married for like 30 years. What if there's someone out there who's better for me than this person? Right? So unanswerable. I don't even know what that means. You've been with a person for 30 years. So like that's, could you find someone else that maybe you'd have a better time with? Maybe. But who knows? Because there's like how many billions of people in the world. So yeah, it can show up in different ways. And I think we need more research to kind of get to the bottom of exactly how are we defining this. And I will admit, I don't stay completely up to date on all the literature in that area, but it's worth studying. But there might be some of what we call relationship OCD that really is not OCD. And there might be some of it that's just kind of regular worries or cold feet before you get married, things like that.
Or preoccupied attachment. I mean, that was one thing, is to be caught in a preoccupied kind of attachment loop. And how does that distinguish between that and relational OCD? But it sounds like that's not something that is kind of in your expertise, but you feel like there's a lot of studying happening.
There is some research on it.
Yeah.
And we should obviously do more research on it.
So what about the relational element for those that have partners that are caught in OCD, whether it's a relational type of preoccupation where their partner's jealous and sees everything through this lens of, you don't love me, you don't love me, you don't love me, we're seeking out this reassurance, or other types of reassurance that we see in OCD. What would you recommend? Because it's easy to sometimes become part of the loop, isn't it? Like if you turn to your partner for that reassurance, the partner gives reassurance, you're like, oh, that feels better. But then it can become in and of itself part of the ritual. So how as a partner can you be helpful and loving and not become part of the loop, but also not just leave them out there in distress?
Yeah. So absolutely, first of all, that partners, whether they love the person with OCD and so they want to protect them from distress. Oh, let me check that for you. Right? Let me wash that for you. Let me give you the reassurance because, I'm all about keeping you feeling good. That happens a lot. And then also there's the other side where the partner with OCD is like, you better help me. They kind of like drag them kicking and screaming. I'm going to hurt myself if you don't give me reassurance, mom. Right? And then you got the mom, kind of caught, right? What am I supposed to do? There's a difference between protection and support. Anxiety, uncertainty, intrusive thoughts, the things that folks with OCD are afraid of are not actually dangerous. They're really unpleasant, but they're not actually dangerous. And it gets back to exposure and response prevention. When we help someone to approach their fears and approach their uncertainty and approach their intrusive thoughts, we're helping them to learn that you can manage these feelings and that they are safe and that they are actually, in many cases, they're short-term, right? They are self-limiting. And so it's the same thing when we work with couples and families. What we want to do is to help the people without OCD, help them to dial back that reassurance, again, with the help of it's not just like one day we're not going to give you any more reassurance, but doing it in a loving way with lots of explanations and lots of rationale for why, to help that person to learn how to manage those things better on their own. And that's where I make the difference between protection, which is I'm going to do everything I can to protect you from distress, which ultimately, especially if it's a child, that's not good. Right? Up to a point, we need to protect our kids, but then also there is the blessing of a skinned knee, and you learn that you can get through distress. We need our kids to learn that. So support means that you, in a controlled way, you're going to help that child or adult get through the distress and learn, I can do this. And again, that's very empowering. I'm saying it really quickly. It's a whole thing. It's a whole process. You're working with a therapist. Everyone's agreeing to everything, for the most part. And sometimes, if adult child says, no, I'm not going to, do this, then sometimes those even more adult parents have to say, well, unilaterally, we're not going to spend money on this for you anymore. We're not going to, do these checking things. You should probably get some help for that. So it can get complicated, but essentially what we're doing is we're helping the loved ones without OCD to support the loved one with OCD by challenging them that they can manage that distress.
I see. So the difference that you're pointing out is the difference between prevention. Like if I'm engaged, I could see easily becoming, if I know my partner's going to get distressed by this, I'm not going to do any behavior that could make them feel jealous. And then that becomes, I guess it's another aspect of the bullying part of the OCD. The OCD itself is the bully, not the person, right? And so if I'm engaging in or avoiding behaviors because I'm scared that my partner's going to get activated, then I'm working on prevention rather than really dealing with what's happening under the activated part.
It's easier to do the rituals, easier to give the reassurance, it's easier to avoid than have my partner get angry, get upset, go through this distress and all of that. And so, you see, we call that symptom system fit, where the OCD symptoms become part of the relationship. They become kind of a third wheel. And you see this like, a husband declining invitations because he knows that his partner doesn't want to interact with certain people because they're contaminated. So, I'll get us out of this, right? Or a parent, I'll call the school and we'll take care of this so that you don't have to do X, Y, or Z that's going to exacerbate the OCD. Again, because the child would get really upset or not go to school and things like that. And unfortunately, when we do that, the person with OCD never has a chance to learn, I'm strong, I could get through this, even if my whoever loved one didn't help me out of this.
So it's coming back to what you were talking about initially, and that is really engaging in this idea of tolerance of the discomfort inside, both for the partner or the parent or the friend, because it's so painful to see somebody upset. It's also painful to experience. Maybe they manifested in anger or control. So you just work through the avoidance. So I guess what you're saying for parents and partners and friends or siblings is that really seek your own help, because it may be that your child or your partner is willing to go and get help, or they may not. But what you don't want is to be caught by that and to really seek support, because there's other ways that you can help that isn't part of prevention and avoidance, but it's you tolerating maybe even your partner's discomfort on a different level.
Absolutely. Yeah. I work with so many people who, they'll call me up. My 30-year-old son has OCD, but he won't get help. Will you talk to him and convince him? What can I say to him? And I say, you know what? It sounds like you're trying too hard. It sounds like you want help more than your son wants help. I'd be happy to work with you as the parents, not involving your son, but maybe there are some things that we can change up. And it turns out that the family dynamics there are often that symptom system fit, that the parents are doing things that kind of keep the person with OCD in that, in that loop. And the person with OCD is kind of, they got it made. Like, oh, mom and dad are giving me all this reassurance. They're doing all these things for me.
I don't ever have to kind of deal with all the anxiety that I'm having going to school or whatever it may be.
Let alone do that terrible exposure therapy that they're talking about, right? Why should I do that? Yeah. So working with the parents to change their dynamics, yeah.
And that gives agency, because what you're saying is no matter what, if you're kind of going with your own sense of agency and being able to try something different, any part of the system that's impacted impacts the system. And you may take, instead of doing the prevention and like, could somebody go over there and help this person? If you're really working with your own self to approach the whole situation differently, it could change the whole system, including, the OCD person actually having more distress and need for intervention if they could really feel that change, I imagine.
Exactly. And that's one of the things that I tell people is that, one of the benefits of allowing your loved one to experience the distress is they might decide, hey, you know what? Maybe I should get some help. Mom and dad aren't going to do everything for me. Maybe I do need to work on that. And sometimes that happens.
So if somebody's out there and they're saying, oh my gosh, this applies to me. I guess since we're on the relational, we'll start with the relational. Is there a resource? What would you recommend for reading to get more support or interventions if you were the partner? And then we'll go to the OCD individual.
Yeah, there are books for people who are loved ones of folks with OCD. I've written one of those. It's called The Family Guide to Getting Over OCD, but there are others. And also reaching out to an OCD expert. OCD experts also, most of them will have experience working with loved ones of people with OCD. And so making sure that you find someone that really does have expertise. They didn't just go to a weekend conference and say, oh, I'm an OCD specialist, but they actually have the experience and the goods to be able to help. That's really important. Another resource for both people with OCD and loved ones of folks with OCD is the International OCD Foundation. And they have an awesome website, iocdf.org. They have an amazing international conference. This year it's in Seattle in another month and a half, usually in the middle of July, I think this year it might be beginning of July. That website has everything. They got articles about every type of OCD you can imagine, from every perspective, from the experts, from people's lived experience. They've got videos. I've recorded some videos for them. They've got book recommendations. They've got how to find a therapist. So that really is your first stop.
That's wonderful. And I guess I also realized that we never really jumped into some of the other things, including medication and ketamine. I know that you've spoken about the most effective is SSRIs, but it depends on what type, but that's helpful, but it needs to be mixed with the exposure therapy. Am I accurate that that's...
Yeah, the data suggests that SSRIs on their own are not going to be as effective as the exposure therapy. When you combine them, a lot of people think, well, a combined treatment is going to be better than either one. Actually, that's not the case. The combined treatment in many studies is not better, I should be really clear, is not better than exposure therapy alone. And there's this idea that, if I take the medication, it makes the exposure easier to do. I'm not sure that we want that. Because if you take away the challenge and exposure is too easy to do, you're not going to learn from it as much. We want what we call desirable difficulties. You want that challenge because that's how you grow. But that said, a lot of people do use both. And SSRIs can be really effective. I think they have like a 40% response rate. So not as high as exposure therapy, which is more like 60 to 70%. Well done exposure therapy, which is not always the case. But again, that's another story maybe. But yeah, there's nothing wrong. Ketamine and psychedelics, they are an experimental treatment. It's fascinating to read about what they're doing and the possibilities. I'm not sure we completely understand how they work, and we don't have a lot of randomized controlled studies yet to show their effects. So still waiting for that, but it's fascinating. And, if we have another treatment for OCD, then that's wonderful. We need more of those. There are other psychological treatments too that we haven't really touched on that show some preliminary effectiveness as well.
And if somebody wants to I know you just actually published a book in 2025, is that accurate, for those with OCD? Could you tell us about that? And then how do people find you if they want to contact you?
Sure. Yeah. My latest book it's called Living Well with OCD. And it is for folks who maybe they're not at a point where they're ready to do therapy yet. Maybe they can't find good therapy. Maybe they've tried therapy and it hasn't helped them as much as they want. Maybe they're scared of doing it because exposure sounds pretty challenging. So this is a book for folks. Hey, how do I manage OCD? The word exposure therapy, it's in the book, but there are no do exposure. there are lots of great books on self-help books for exposure and response prevention. This is not one of them. This is like, how do I manage? How do I negotiate with work around this? How do I work in relationships with this? How do I take care of myself? How do I not feel guilty for having OCD? So I love this book. I'm really proud of that. That's one of my latest ones.
I love that. And we will have that in the show notes.
Cool.
So that those of you that want to find it, please do. It sounds exceptional.
To get in touch with me, probably the easiest way is to go through the University of North Carolina. I have a website if you look up UNC Chapel Hill, Jonathan Abramowitz. Also have another private practice website. It's just J Abramowitz. It's www.jabramowitz.com. Recently, people have told me there's an older version of that floating around somewhere. You want the newer one that's been updated recently. I update it every couple of months or so. So www.jabramowitz.com for that.
Thank you so much. You've just brought a wealth of knowledge, and I so appreciate you taking the time to jump on with us. I really, really have a lot of gratitude.
My pleasure, Anne. I always enjoy talking about this, and if someone has learned anything, then that's a plus. But thanks for asking these questions and for having me on. It's a pleasure.
All right. Thanks so much for joining us today at Therapist Uncensored. If you got as much out of this as I did, pass it on. Rate and review. That helps people find us, but pass it on so other people can have this great information too. Stay tuned for the second in our series on anxiety and OCD. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you around the bend.
Therapist Uncensored is Ann Kelly and Sue Marriott. This podcast is edited by Jack Anderson.